Hello, friends. Once again, it is good to be with you. My name is Kristopher Lowen, and this is Behind the Sermon, the podcast all about the art of preaching, from the twinkle of an idea to late nights spent writing to the time spent practicing, all the way up until the moment of truth on stage. This show pulls back the curtain on the beautiful and memorable and rocky and terrifying process known as the sermon, creating this unique moment in time. And, in this episode of Behind the Sermon, you'll get to hear a sermon that I preached at the Redlands Adventist Church in Southern California, where I get the privilege and joy of serving as the lead pastor. And as always on this program, you will get to hear my candid reflections about how I felt about it, how it went, how the process unfolded along the way, and I'll explore the many things that were left overlooked and left out. I'll look at the victories and the failures and everything else in between. So let's get at it. The first segment of our show is entitled Context is Everything. Context is everything. And in this segment of the show, it's where we take some time to talk about what I was trying to do with this particular sermon, where I was at, what the sermon series was about, if that applies, and so on. And, we are in the second week of a sermon series on the book of Mark. And my friend and associate and one of the other pastors on staff at the Redlands Church, Chris Stanley, he preached the first sermon in the series, and he preached that a week ago. That was on September 21. And because we're just kind of beginning the podcast, I'm wanting I made the decision to make all the early episodes be primarily about me, but we actually primarily about me. Oh, nice. Primarily about my sermons, at least for the time being. But Chris was gracious enough not only to preach on that Sabbath, but also to sit down with me for an interview. So we laid that interview down last week and had a good conversation about his message. So that one will drop on the podcast at some point in the future. It'll come out some week where I'm not preaching. But for now, you get to hear me reflect again about the sermon that I preached on the 28th. And like I said, he kicked the sermon series off, actually. And I was grateful for that. I've seen churches, I've been around churches where the sermon series isn't necessarily carried on by the other pastors on staff. The senior pastor will go through a sermon series, and if one of the other pastors preaches on occasion, they'll just preach on whatever they want to, and there's probably something that's great and fun and good about that. And I've been one of those associate pastors over the course of my career, but I also really like the coherence and just the flow of, listen, we as a church, no matter whose voice is up front on the stage speaking, we as a church have made the decision to work through this certain sermon series. We're preaching through this thing. And so no matter who's speaking, they get invited to share. And so I was happy that Chris was willing to be gracious enough to kick us off on this sermon series. And kind of a challenging text. He preached about sin. But this one was the second series, or the second sermon of the series, and look here, I've gone 4.5 minutes in the episode and have not even mentioned the subject of the series, which is the book of Mark. The book of Mark, which is one of the Gospels, and it's regarded by many scholars as being the oldest of the Gospels that we have in our Bible. Gospel is another word, if you're not familiar, for biography of Jesus' life. It's the story of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And even though it comes as the second one in that list, and in the most Bibles that you get today, it's widely believed to be the earlier of the four, and even that maybe some of the other three, especially Matthew and Luke, may have used Mark as a resource, or maybe the three of them all used a similar, or a resource that they all held in common. So this week's sermon was from the book of Mark, chapter 2, And it's a passage or a series of passages, a series of stories that I love. And there's so much material here. There's so much you could do with. I joked with the congregation. I didn't really joke. I was actually being quite serious. You could do many sermons just on the one text, which was, for me, was Mark chapter 2, 1 through 12. But the whole chapter is just brilliant, and there's so much material there that you could do all kinds of things with. You can learn so much through, teach so much through, walk away with so many bits of inspiration and insight and just thoughts about our own lives. And it's a great set of passages. And some of the scholars tend to call them controversy narratives, where Jesus gets himself in trouble in one way or another. And in the story where we focused on for this sermon, chapter 1 through 12, Jesus gets himself in trouble. And that's sort of, I'm said euphemistically, but Jesus gets himself in trouble by healing someone. So essentially the long and the short of the story is just to give you some context, and you're going to hear the sermon in just a moment, so you'll get to hear it many times. But essentially Jesus heals a paralyzed man, but before he does so, he lets the man and the rest of the people there present at that moment, lets them know that he has been forgiven in addition to being healed. And that is that part of it is quite scandalous in that moment. And originally when I started working on this sermon on Mark chapter 2, the thing that I thought I wanted to do with it was to tie verses 1 through 12 to the passage at the end. There's this phrase, Jesus is identified at the very beginning in the story that we used for this sermon about the healing of the paralyzed man, the Son of Man. That phrase is used, but then that phrase comes back at the very end of the same chapter, in the section about the Sabbath, the breaking of the Sabbath, where Jesus says, "And the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath." It's this phrase that comes back, and in both cases, that phrase is kind of used by Jesus and used by the author, used by Mark as sort of a riddle. About which the answer is Jesus' true identity. And so I wanted to play with both of those passages. That was kind of my original plan, my original idea, because there's sort of a question that they both that arise out of both stories. The first one: who has the authority to forgive sin? Well, the Son of Man. And who has the authority to interpret or reinterpret the Sabbath? The Son of Man, the Messiah. And that's something that's one angle I thought we were going to go in, but it didn't end up feeling exactly right, and I kind of got excited about the way that we actually went, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Another angle that I think was interesting was the idea to do the whole sermon about forgiveness. And there's this great line from N.T. Wright's commentary on this passage. It's a great series, by the way. It's called Mark for Everyone, Luke for Everyone, Matthew for Everyone. He does many of the books of the New Testament, and they're called, the name of the book of the New Testament, for everyone. And they're really approachable commentaries, applicable, interesting. It's beautiful, good stuff. But he has this line. He says, "Forgiveness is always a political act." And that it was an interesting idea, because N.T. Wright sort of discusses this idea that there was interpersonal forgiveness happening in that moment, aside from the divine forgiveness, which is why the teachers and scholars of the law were so upset, was because of the implications about the divine forgiveness. But N.T. Wright, and he's actually the source. I made a joke during the sermon about how, one scholar said that what if, this may have been Jesus' his personal house. And so that when he said, "I forgive you," he was actually forgiving them for like digging a hole in his roof. And that, in the first place, it was less of a divine forgiveness thing and more of a personal forgiveness thing. And so N.T. Wright sort of, he has a section where he kind of talks about, listen, forgiveness is a political act. And when you say that you've forgiven someone, that confronts many other people in the situation, and that whole thing made me think of there's a film called a documentary that I just love. I found so inspiring and beautiful and wonderful. It's called Forgiving Dr. Mengele. And maybe you've seen it. It's about a woman named Eva Moses Core, and she survived the Holocaust. She and her twin sister were in one of the prison camps. I don't know if it was Auschwitz or one of the others, but she was there, and there was a doctor named Dr. Mengele, and this doctor did experiments on twins who were in that concentration camp. And Eva Moses Core and her sister survived those experiments, and later in life, this woman has moved to the United States, and she's gone through the process of forgiving this man. And one of the themes of the film is, the theme of the film is obviously about forgiveness and how it works. But one of the themes that comes up is that there's a whole huge group of people who also survived the Holocaust, or who lost family members, or who were personally affected by that experience, and who take issue with Eva Moses Core forgiveness of Dr. Mengele. And there's some people even in the documentary who say, "Who are you? Who is she to say that she can? She has no right to stand in that." Anyway, this is a whole other digression of area that it not only was left out of the sermon, it's a whole other entire sermon. And that happens frequently. And so, just my point that you could preach a whole bunch of different sermons. You've already had 3 so far in just one podcast. And, I've been talking with some of my colleagues about doing a sermon series in the future. Maybe we'll do it in the spring sometime, where we preach on one single passage week by week, and we keep going back to it and keep going back to it and keep going back to it and keep squeezing it for more and keep learning more from it, and just seeing like how many weeks could we go through a sermon series on one single passage. I don't know how many weeks you could make it, but I think it could be kind of fun to do, and I think we're probably going to do it at some point in the future. So anyway, that's a lot of introduction and a lot of conversation about what we were trying to do with this particular series or with this particular sermon. But really, my goal for this sermon, where we ended up going, where we were talking about these 3 observations about the friends who brought the paralyzed man for healing. I really wanted to drive at that question at the end. What will you do? What will you do for your friend who is suffering, for your quote-unquote paralyzed friend? What effort will you make for them? How will you express your faith? What will you be motivated by? But specifically, what roofs will you dig through? How will you sacrifice yourself on behalf of the people in your life that you love? And that's a compelling question for me, and that's really where I wanted to drive out with the sermon. And so that's where we're going to go with it this week. And I'm going to go ahead and roll the sermon right now. And in just a moment, we'll be back for segment number 2. In fact, after the sermon rolls, we'll be back for segment number 2. But for those of you who have already heard the sermon, you can fast forward to about 50 minutes or 51 minutes on your timing scale on your app. Just slide forward to about 51 or so minutes, and you should be right where we'll be back with the next segment of the show. Good morning. Happy Sabbath. It is good to be with you today. Man, I miss a week of church, and it feels like an eternity. So it's good to be back with you. This last weekend, I got to take part in a retreat with SECC. It's a very enlightened conference that we're a part of. I love it. They provide an opportunity for pastors to take a couple of days up at Pine Springs Ranch and to pray and to rejuvenate. I got to meet some new people, and it was a beautiful thing. And I came back sick, which I don't think was part of the plan, but I came back sick. And I'm on the upward swing with you. It's good to be with you and be back, on my feet. I got to preach over at Relevant this morning. If you have not been over there, the worship and the moment is just beautiful and amazing. There's so many talented kids every week, young kids who are leading worship in there. If you haven't visited 945, I invite you. I'm going to be speaking some over there in the next couple of months, and it's partly selfish because I want to worship with them. But man, it's a beautiful thing. You will not be disappointed if you're over there. One other thing is next Sabbath. This didn't make it in the bulletin, and I'm sorry for that. But next Sabbath, we are going to have an all-church potluck, and so that will take place in the auditorium after church next Sabbath, October 5. So you're all invited to come and join for that, and I'm excited about that. My mother will be here next Sabbath, so she's going to help put that on. She's all about the party, so she'll be here. And anyway, so that's next Sabbath. Please plan on joining us. And I'm sorry, I kind of have like some housekeeping stuff before we get into the sermon, but I have a couple more items. Another item is with regards to the search committee for the family pastor position that's open. I want you all to know that the committee is moving. We're progressing. We have moved into the interviewing stage of the process, and I hope that we'll have very positive reports for you very, very soon. So we are progressing very nicely, and I'm pleased with that progress, and I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but we're going to be interviewing people. So also, thanks to Pastor Chris for preaching last week. I watched in with interest on his sermon. He began our sermon series let's go to here. He began our sermon series on the book of Mark, but he also was so gracious as to join me on the podcast about the sermon. And so our church has a podcast. I don't know if you know that, but we're podcasting our sermons. It's called Behind the Sermon. You can text that in on your phone in iTunes or in Google Play or in Stitcher or Spotify or wherever you. And it's a conversation about the message, and it includes the audio of the sermon itself. So Chris was kind enough to sit with me. I interviewed him. We talked about the sermon, and then you get to hear the sermon. It was great, so I'm grateful for him to join me in that. And like I indicated, we are going through the book of Mark, and Chris began that sermon series last Sabbath, Mark chapter 1, and so that's where we're continuing today. And the reason we're doing the book of Mark is, over the summer we had this series about, anxiety and feeling anxious and worried, right? And then we had a sermon series about calling. Those are kind of topical, and I think topical sermon series are great, and there's something also powerful and meaningful about going right from the text. And so I can't tell you exactly where all we're going to go. We're going to let the scriptures lead us and speak to us week by week. So today we're in Mark chapter 2, and I want to invite Renee and Alessia up. They're going to read our scripture for us today. Thank you guys for your willingness. I appreciate it so much. So they're going to read for us from Mark chapter 2.
When Jesus returned to Capernaum several days later, the news spread quickly that he was back home. Soon, the house where he was staying was so packed with visitors that there was no more room, even outside the door. While he was preaching God's word to them, 4 men arrived, carrying a paralyzed man on a mat. They couldn't bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, so they dug a hole through the roof above his head. Then they lowered the man on the mat, right down in front of Jesus. Seeing their faith, Jesus said to the paralyzed man,
"My child, your sins are forgiven."
But some of the teachers of religious law who were sitting there thought to themselves, "What is he saying? This is blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins." Jesus knew immediately what they were thinking, so he asked them,
"Why do you question this in your hearts? Is it easier to say to the paralyzed man, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or 'Stand up, pick up your mat and walk'? So, I will prove to you that the Son of Man has the authority on earth to forgive sins."
Then Jesus turned to the paralyzed man and said,
"Stand up, pick up your mat, and go home."
And the man jumped up, grabbed his mat, and walked out through the stunned onlookers. They were all amazed and praised God, exclaiming, "We've never seen anything like this before."
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it. All right. So if you want to keep your Bibles open to that, Mark chapter 2, we're gonna look at that all throughout. You may want to refer to it as we work through this. This morning, I want to make 3 observations from this text. And I joked over at Relevant a little bit earlier that we could probably do a whole sermon series just on this passage. There is so much here. So many observations we could make, so many things that we could learn. So today we're just going to take one small nibble, and then we'll go to lunch. So I want to look at today 3 observations, and I'm going to get this clicker to work. There it goes. Yes, so we're going to make 3 observations, and specifically, I want to make 3 observations about the friends of the paralyzed man, all right? We're gonna look specifically at the friend of the paralyzed man, and we're gonna make 3 observations, and I think these observations have something to tell us about the way that we are as a church in following God's mission, and the way we are as individuals, as living out followers of Jesus in our world today. So 3 observations about the friends. The first one is that the expectations of the friends did not match the outcome. Yeah? The expectations of the friends did not match the outcome. When I was in high school, I had the incredible privilege of spending about a month in Europe. At the time, when I was about 17 years old, I had no idea the privilege that it was at the time. It was kind of how it is when we're that age, right? We don't totally know the privilege that but incredible, profound privilege. And now I am here today. I have children, and I have a job, and I have I have a house payment and all that. And it's just, it's you can't just go away for a month at a time anymore. And but man, what an incredible gift that I had, that chance to be away. And one of the things that happened on this trip is we signed up. I play upright bass. You guys haven't seen me play yet, but maybe sometime we'll drag that out here. But Paige and I, we met. We played an orchestra together, and my string orchestra. We went on this tour in Europe, and this picture is taken in Florence. I don't know if you guys can tell that, but and I'm on the far right. I have the Seahawks jersey on appropriately. So. One of the things that happens, we sign up with a tour company to go on this, tour with the orchestra, right? And the tour company, they provided, it was sort of all inclusive, they provided the transportation, and they arranged for the hotels and the meals and whatever. And so part of the planning for it was the tour company asked us, and they said, do you want a vegetarian meal or the regular meal? And I was with a whole big group of vegetarians, and I was very proud of myself that I grew up in a family of omnivores, and I said, I'm not a vegetarian, and so I ordered the regular meal. And then on the trip, so we would go to these restaurants, and they would say, okay, who ordered the regular meal and who ordered the vegetarian meal? And time after time after time after time, I got exactly what I had ordered. And it was this gray blob with sauce and overcooked something with it. It was just this thing. And then all my friends around me, all my vegetarian friends around, they got these beautiful, colorful displays of vegetables and pasta, and it was so the disappointment was so extreme that about a couple days into the trip, I started saying, "Yeah, I'm vegetarian." And they eventually in the trip, they had to yell at us. They said, "Listen, if you didn't order vegetarian, you can't say that you're vegetarian. You have to have the gray thing that they're serving." And so here's the thing: I got exactly what I ordered, right? I got exactly what I had asked for. And as it happens, I was disappointed by that. And I kind of think that there's a sort of a similar dynamic in this story, except for instead of being disappointed by the expectations, their expectations were exceeded, right? They had low, the friends of the paralyzed man in our story, the friends of the paralyzed man had low expectations, but they didn't realize it. I had low expectations, and I didn't realize it either, and I ended up being disappointed, but theirs were way, way exceeded. Jesus had this reputation. That's part of what the chapter 1 of Mark is all about. Jesus had built this reputation in the region, so much so that crowds were following him everywhere, right? He couldn't get a moment alone, and in fact, he was running away and hiding from place to place. That's why he ended up in chapter 2 of Mark in Capernaum, right? He was trying to get away from the crowds. He had built this reputation. Everybody knew Jesus would heal you, and that's why the friends brought him their paralyzed friend. Right? They had expectations. They knew Jesus would heal him. But in the passage, as we just heard, he was healed, yes, but even more, he was forgiven, right? And that's a theme in the book of Mark. Actually, scholars will say that in fact, it's a literary tool, those two things coming together, that Jesus heals and he forgives over and over and over again. In fact, Mark uses it as a literary tool to point toward Jesus' identity, right? And in a way, that's what this passage is about. It's saying Jesus did both, and it was a sign that he wasn't just a regular person, that he was the Son of God, that he was the promised one, that he was the Messiah. We actually see that in other places in the Gospels as well. In Matthew chapter 11 and in Luke chapter 7, John the Baptist, the one that Chris preached about last week, John the Baptist, he has followers, right? And John the Baptist sent his followers to talk to Jesus, and they sent him with the message and said, Jesus, John wants to know, are you the one? Are you the Messiah? Or are we waiting for someone else? And what did Jesus say? He said, tell them what you've heard and tell them what you've seen. He said, people are being healed, people are being raised from the dead. And then he says, and then he quotes Isaiah and says, the prison doors are being opened. People are being forgiven of their sins. Jesus points to this very dynamic, both of those together as a sign of who he is. Jesus exceeded the friends' expectations, as he often does. I studied in seminary at Fuller Theological Seminary, it's just down the road in Pasadena, and I was in the missions department, the mission program, and one of the themes that came up throughout my program, as we talked about the mission of the church and God's mission in the world, we talked about this dynamic. There's sort of this common theme, almost like a debate, and sometimes they get pitted against each other, but there's sort of different conceptions of what God is up to in the world, and at its extreme, usually it's not as at extremes, but sometimes at the extremes, there's one camp that says that God is about righting wrongs. That God is a God of justice. He's the God of the orphan and the widow, and he takes care of people that are oppressed. And when we join God in his mission, we join him in protecting people who are weak and who are vulnerable, right? That's what God's mission is about. So we talk about justice. But then we'll just leave this here for a minute. We'll come back. But then there's another end of the spectrum, right? There's sort of another end, and sometimes they're in tension. Are you with me? There's another end that says, no, God's mission is about salvation. God's mission is about holiness. God's mission is about dealing with sin. God's mission is about making the world new. Right? And so God cares about our hearts. God cares about our souls. God wants us to know and to follow Jesus, right? Are you guys familiar with this? Sort of this tension between these two. And sometimes they're kind of diametrically opposed with each other. Sometimes you'll get a leader on one side or the other. Like maybe you get a leader over here. It says like maybe who's way on the stream. All right, you guys with me? This is a caricature. This is unfair judgment on Pastor Kristopher's part. All right, so nobody's like that. But you could get someone way on this extreme who would say, well, who cares if someone's hungry? If they don't know Jesus, they're not going to be saved. Why are we bothering with worrying about temporal stuff? We need to worry about them being saved. Yeah. But then maybe on the other end of the spectrum, you might have someone saying, listen, nobody cares to hear anything about God if they're hungry. Yeah? So are you with me? Sometimes these sort of viewpoints are kind of in opposition with each other. There's a little bit of tension. They fight against it. And sometimes we end up with whole organizations that maybe kind of represent these in some way, maybe not even intentionally. So sometimes you end up with kind of like, evangelistic-oriented organizations. Like in Walla Walla, we had this organization called Gospel Outreach. It was all about reaching people right over here on the corner, right? There's quiet hours, much about evangelism, connecting with people, helping people to know who Jesus is in the world, joining God in his mission, right? So sometimes some of the like our broadcast stations or radio stations are focused on that on the message, right? Who Jesus is. But then we also have organizations and just in the Adventist world who are focused kind of more primarily on the tangible stuff. I think about ADRA, right? Think about even just in Redlands, Helping Hands Pantry. Just thinking about Loma Linda University Health, right? About healing people's bodies, just like we talked about in the story. And sometimes I think we can get the idea that these are like at odds, like we have to choose one or the other, like we have to be on an extreme. But here's the thing, in this story, I think Jesus insists that God's mission in the world is holistic. It's all of those. It's both of those. It's not either or. It's not just one. It's both. We want people to know Jesus, and the world ought to be ordered in a just way, that God's kingdom is here now.
And we even signal that, even in some of our organizations that are practical, like the tagline with Loma Linda, to make man whole. It sort of tips its hat that, listen, our mission is bigger than just one little segment. God's work in the world is beyond all that we could ask or imagine, we read in Ephesians chapter 3. And so if we, as followers of Jesus, or if we as a church, if we stay rigid in one place, on one of these extremes or the other, and we say, no, God's mission is only about this, our expectations of God are way too low. And I think we'll be surprised, and that'll be a good thing, but for me, I'm more interested in joining God in his work now, in his holistic work. And so I think we need to be careful to think about what are our expectations about what God is up to through my individual life, through us as a community. There's this line from Ellen White, one of the founders of the Adventist Church. She writes in Ministry of Healing, and some of us will be familiar with this quote. If less time were given to sermonizing, here she is, she's criticizing us preachers over here, and more time were spent in personal ministry, greater results would be seen, right? Some of you have read this. Some of you are very familiar with it. The poor are to be relieved, the sick cared for, the sorrowing and the bereaved comforted, the ignorant instructed, the inexperienced counseled. We are to weep with those who weep and rejoice. Oops. Let's go. You go back one. I got ahead of ourselves. We are to weep with those who weep. Let's see. Can I get it? There we go. Rejoice with those who rejoice, accompanied by the power of persuasion. There it is. There's the power of persuasion, the power of prayer, the power of the love of God. This work cannot be without fruit. She goes on. We should ever remember that the object of the medical missionary, wow, this is the same passage. Interesting. The object of the medical missionary work is to point sin-sick men and women to the man of Calvary who taketh away the sin of the world. By beholding, they will be changed into his likeness. Talk of his love, tell of his power to save. So the first observation about the friends of the paralyzed man today is, what are our expectations, and are they too low? These men that lowered their paralyzed man through the roof, they found that their expectations were too low, that the scope of God's mission was beyond what they had expected. Yeah? So that's the first observation. The second observation about these men, and it's related. So they came with the expectation that Jesus would heal their friend. Yeah, that's why they brought him in the first place. Jesus was famous. Everyone knew that they were that he was healing people left and right, and so they brought their friend in hopes that he would be healed. And so it wouldn't be unreasonable to say that they were motivated by love. They were motivated by a selfless interest in the help of their friend. We don't get any hint in the story that the paralyzed man had paid them to bring him, for example. We don't get any hint that they had lost a bet and that they were paying him back. We don't get any hint that they were trying to prove a point. They weren't putting Jesus to the test. They didn't have some kind of obligation. None of those things. All indicators point that they were doing what they were doing out of the love that was in their heart for their friend who was paralyzed. Yeah, they were motivated by love. This past fall, I got into a wreck with my car, and this is my Ford. Paige and I bought this car brand new the year we got married. It was a 2005. This is one of the only cars certainly at that time, it was the only car I've ever purchased brand new. And I drove it for 240,000 miles. The original motor, original transmission, drove great. The seats were comfortable. I loved this car. I loved that it didn't have a payment. It was fantastic. Really, really wonderful. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Ran like a top, did not burn oil. Great car. And then I was driving it one afternoon, and I was going to pick up the boys at school, and a couple of girls in their dad's brand new Civic were texting, and they blasted right through a stop sign and slammed right into the front of my car. And their car, as what happens with new cars, disintegrated essentially into nothingness. And mine looked like this, where the bumper was sort of off. But because it's a Ford with 250,000 miles on it, the insurance company said, well, that's not worth anything. And so they totaled it, which meant, horror of horrors, that I had to go car shopping. And this is the point of me telling you about this. I hate car shopping. I hate it. It's the worst thing ever. If you're a car salesman, I love you, God bless you, but I hate car shopping. It's not that I don't like new cars. If I could have it my way, I would get a new car like every month. I would just have it arrive at my house, and then I would get to, drive a different car, and it'd be fun. I like that variety, but I hate car shopping. And it's because car salesmen and car salespeople have an agenda. And everyone is clear on what that agenda is. They're not asking me about my job or my family because they care about me. They're trying to get dirt so that they can manipulate me into buying a car from them. Oh, I hate it. It's the worst thing. And everybody knows that there's an agenda. And everybody knows that we're playing this game together. And we all have to play the game together because I need a car. I have to leave with a car. Oh, it's awful. I hate buying cars. Oh. It's the worst. It's the worst. And so this is the thing. Part of the reason I hate buying cars is because our motives bleed through into our behavior. You can't avoid, there's no way around it. The things that motivate us bleed through into our methodology. The reason that we're doing something, it affects how we do it. And even if we can't totally sense it or get it, other people can. We know, especially those of us that were born after 1980, we know when we're being marketed to. We've been marketed to our whole lives. We know. We have radar for it. We can pick it up instantly. We know. And so if you're not motivated by love, we immediately know. And it comes out in our behavior. I mentioned that I took my degree in Christian mission from Fuller Seminary. And I took a class where the entire class was essentially about one text, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. For the love of Christ compels us. There's a whole quarter on what does it mean that the love of Christ compels us in the world. What does it mean? What does it feel like that Jesus' love is the driving force behind my actions? The love of Christ compels us. Therefore. And so we, as followers of Jesus, as a church, we need to watch out because there's all kinds of other stuff that could motivate us, and we need to be aware of it. Sometimes I wonder if certain people are motivated by self-vindication in their mission work. They really want this person to keep Sabbath, because they want to feel more right and more correct and more superior about the fact that I keep Sabbath. And so if someone else starts keeping Sabbath, then I feel vindicated. Are you with me? You ever felt that before? Ever wondered that? Whew. There's a couple, well, we can be friends together. There's a couple of us here that have felt that. I've felt that. We can be motivated by ego. I want so-and-so to do this or to do that so that I can feel better. I can feel superior. I can feel like I'm right. Sometimes I've wondered if we're motivated by judgment, like contempt. Like the workers that are all paid the same rate. Jesus tells that parable about the workers, some that come the beginning of the day, some that come the middle, some that come the end, they all get paid the same amount. But the people that came at the beginning are resentful of the fact that the people that came at the end got paid the same amount. I wonder if that resentment ever fuels us. And so it comes out as judgment to people that are not behaving the way that we think they should. I've behaved the right way my whole life. I'm fourth-generation Adventist. I keep all the rules. So why should you get to not have to keep the rules? And we got to watch out for what motivates us. What if I'm motivated by trying to get my conscience cleared? What if I'm motivated by thinking ahead to my future self in 2 decades and I'm feeling guilty and ashamed of what someone did in my family? And so I'm thinking about, man, I'm going to say something now because I'm going to feel ashamed of myself later if I don't. What motivation is that? I don't know if that's the love of Christ. It might be, but I don't know. Our motive bleeds through into our methodology. The reason that we do stuff, it affects what we actually do, and people can tell. Now, I think as a church that love is our methodology. I think Jesus has been really, really clear with that. In fact, in John chapter 16, Jesus is talking to his disciples and he's sort of pointing them ahead, right? This is going to happen. I'm going to die. But listen, he says in John chapter 16, he says, listen, when I go away, I'm going to send the Holy Spirit. I'm going to send the Helper. He's going to be with you. And he will what? He will convict the world of sin. You know, Pastor Chris last week talked about the importance of sin, of naming sin, of how, especially for those who are stuck in those positions of injustice, how important it is for someone to say, no, that's wrong. But look here, Jesus says in John chapter 16, verse 8, whose job is it to convict the world of sin? The Spirit. And there's problems that arise when the church takes on that mantle and get out signs and go out and march and start deciding that, no, it's our job as the church. We're supposed to convict the world. That's not what Jesus said. He said the Spirit would convict the world of sin. The church, our job is to love. You know, in the very next chapter, John chapter 17, Jesus says, and by this the whole world will know you are my disciples by how you love one another. Our job is to love. It's the methodology and it's the motive. Our job is to love. Spirit will convict. Our job is to trust it. You know, that same passage from Ellen White in Ministry of Healing, there's a famous section in there at the beginning that I skipped over. I want to go back to. Christ's method alone. Some of us are even more familiar with this one. Christ's method alone will give true success in reaching people. It's a beautiful passage. The Savior mingled with men as one who desired their good. He showed his sympathy for them, ministered to their need, won their confidence, and then, and only then, we might say, bade them follow me. So there's two observations for you this morning, two observations about the friends of the paralyzed man. First, we need to think about our expectations, and are they too low? Because God's mission is big, right? The second, what are we motivated by? Are we motivated by love, or are we motivated by something else? Because it affects how we do what we do. Now, the third and final observation this morning about the friend, and this one is a little bit of a tougher one. I wonder if it's because the battery is dead, if that's why I keep clicking and it doesn't go. So, sadly, we cannot say in recent years, because the mass killing of people in public environments is not a new thing in our country. But one thing that is new is there's kind of a criticism that I've seen, a postmodern deconstruction of this phrase, thoughts and prayers. And some of you maybe have seen some of the memes that have gone about. Maybe some of you have read the articles of kind of the critique of that phrase, thoughts and prayers. And namely, that phrase has been critiqued by people who ostensibly are in positions where they might do something more than offer their thoughts and prayers. It's not like a renunciation of offering someone your prayers, but it's sort of when someone's in a position of power, a position of influence, in a position where it would seem like they may be able to do something more substantive than offer their thoughts and prayers, they only offer their thoughts and prayers. And so this has been critiqued, right? Sort of the idea that it's possible to give cheap sympathy. It's possible to pose like we really care, but aren't really willing to get our hands dirty. And you know, I think the friends of the paralyzed man in the story in Mark chapter 2, they didn't offer thoughts and prayers, right? I mean, they may have, but they put their money where their mouth was, right? Have you ever thought about it? But just think about it for a minute. Have you ever thought they cut a hole in someone's roof? I mean, I'm sure that some of you who are like ER physicians, you have crazy stories about people trying to get in or doing wild things to try to get help, and we probably could have lots of hours of fantastic conversations about that. But for me, this seems really, really out there. You know, you come to someone's door, and you're like, the house is full. Let's cut a hole through the roof. You know, like it's pretty extreme, right? There's one scholar that I was reading actually last week who made the observation that there's some people who teach actually that was Jesus' house, like he owned that house. And so when he says to the dude, hey, you're forgiven, he was actually forgiving him for cutting a hole in his roof. So he wasn't like, someone, they're making this, how scholars are. They're making this argument. There's like, no, he wasn't trying to be the Son of God. He was just saying, dude, you cut a hole in my roof, but hey, it's cool. Like, it's crazy, But what are we willing to do? That word, Jesus, he recognizes their faith, right? He's surprised by their faith, it says in the passage. And that word shows up 4 other times in the book of Mark. And each time that word, faith, shows up, it's in verse 5 in our passage. It's used describing a time where Jesus smashes through social ideals. He smashes through obstacles. He gets himself in trouble. He crosses social boundaries. In fact, the very next chapter, in Mark chapter 3, we already see the powers that be are plotting Jesus' death. When Jesus heals, when he is about his mission in the world, it ruffles feathers. It gets people in trouble. It gets his followers in trouble. It gets himself in trouble. When Jesus follows his mission in the world, it costs something. It's not just thoughts and prayers. And here's where the rubber meets the road for us as a community, for us as a church, for us as individuals. We have people in our lives who are paralyzed. You have people in your life who are paralyzed. They're in desperate need of the kingdom to come and show up for them. You have people that you love who have had suicidal ideation this week. There are people in our lives who are suffering under crippling anxiety, who are frozen in depression. There's people in our lives who are going through the paralysis of divorce, or whose relationship is on the rocks and isn't working and is broken. We have people in our lives that we love who are going through addiction, who are going through financial turmoil. We all have paralyzed people in our lives. We have people that we know who don't yet know Jesus. Some of them are really little. So the question that I want to leave us with this morning is, what roofs are you willing to smash through? What kind of messes are you willing to make on behalf of the people who are paralyzed in your life? And we, collectively, as a church, what sort of roofs are we willing to smash? What social boundaries will we cross? What kind of messes will we get ourselves in pursuit of this great and expansive mission of God in our world? Perhaps for some of us, that means we're not going to give up on our education. And we're going to keep plowing through. For some of us, it might have to do with giving. It might have to do with generosity. It might have to do with sacrifice. For some of us, it might have to do with sacrificing an aspect of our reputation or how we're seen, and maybe taking on some sort of stigma or embarrassment because of standing up in a certain way. I don't know what it is. But that's the question that I want to leave you with today. What roofs will you smash through in your pursuit of Jesus? I want to invite the band to come up, or we have a one-man band for our closing. Oh, brilliant. Come on up. So we're going to sing this song, He Knows My Name. And as you sing this song, as we sing it together, I want to imagine those people that came to mind, your paralyzed friend. I want you to imagine them singing these words. He knows my name. There's someone out there who you're connected with? What would the love of Christ compel you to do in their lives? Someone singing, He knows my name, He knows my every thought, He sees each tear that falls and hears me when I call. The question for us is, will we be the answer to those prayers? Let's sing together.
I have a maker. He formed my heart before even time began. My life was in His hands. He knows my name. He knows my every thought. He sees each tear that falls, and He hears me when I call. I have a Father. He calls me His own. He'll never leave me, no matter where I go. He knows my name. He knows my every thought. He sees each tear that falls and hears me when I call. He knows my name. He knows my every thought. He sees each tear that falls and hears me when I call.
Let's pray together our benedictions from Ephesians chapter 3. I pray that out of His glorious riches He may strengthen you with power through His Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and how high and how deep is the love of Christ, and to know that this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Now, to Him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we could ask or imagine, according to His power that is at work within us, to Him be the glory in the church and in the name of Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.
Awesome. All right. So we are back, and you've listened to the sermon, or you've fast forwarded through the sermon. And you know what? Either way, God bless you. All right. I'm with you. I fast forward sometimes on podcasts, especially when there are advertisements. Shh, don't tell anyone. So, the second segment of the show is called Microphone Therapist, and if I had to be honest, I would say this is my favorite segment. It's the one where I take the chance. I take the chance sitting here right now tonight. I'm recording on my Lazy Boy in my bedroom upstairs in the house. It's a very, very fancy studio. But it's the part where I get to pour my heart out and I get to share and say, listen, this is what I loved about the sermon. This is what I didn't love. This is what I hated. This is what I would, this is the part that I felt self-conscious about. This is what I was thinking in the week leading up to it. And this is how my emotions were running wild and so on. So The first part of a microphone therapist, I just asked, how did I feel? And in all honesty, I felt sick. I was sick the week before, and you may be able to hear a little bit of that in my voice. There's a little bit of gravel there. When I listened to the recording of the sermon later, I could really hear the gravel in my voice. It was really an unusual week. The church that I work for is incredibly enlightened and beautiful, and they allow the pastors. In fact, they encourage the pastors to take a few days off every year. 2 or 3 times a year, we can go take 2 or 3 nights, and they pay for the hotel. And I say hotel in quotes because it's up at the church-owned youth camp. But it's fun. It's a little rustic, but it was great and beautiful, and it's up in the mountains, and there's no cell service. And so I went and had a little spiritual retreat. The church, or the conference that I'm a part of, sort of the broader organization, they set the dates, and so it is when it is. It is when they say it is. And so this past week was when they said it was. So it was Sunday through Wednesday. I actually ended up coming back Tuesday night. But I went up for a retreat, and I started getting sick on the way home on Tuesday night. And by the time I got to Wednesday morning, I felt terrible. I was dizzy, and I had the chills. And so I really didn't even work on Wednesday. I just stayed home. I didn't want to get people sick. And then Thursday, I was still feeling terrible, and I kind of sort of worked a little bit, but mostly I didn't. And so it was a wild week. One of the themes of the spiritual retreat I was on was to not work while you're there and to just be present. And it was sort of focusing on inviting pastors to let their ministry flow out of who they are, as opposed to what they do. And that's a big challenge for pastors, and I'm not going to unpack all that right now, but so I took the opportunity, and we spent time in worship and spent time in prayer, and there were some presentations, and there was some time to be alone. There was time to exercise, and I really leaned into it. And then I came home sick. And so, last week when I didn't preach, I did quite a bit of work on this sermon. So I already had sort of an outline. I kind of knew what I wanted to do, but it definitely was not all the way there. And so I got up to preach on Saturday, on Sabbath, and I was strangely calm. And that's a lot of an introduction to get to the point to say that I felt calm. It felt very odd to be as calm as I was, because I did not work on this sermon nearly as much as I would like to. And I know you probably are all rolling your eyes now at this point, because every single time I get on this microphone, I say, "Oh, I didn't have enough time to prepare," and so you're probably all thinking I'm nuts, because I always say that. And let me tell you though, especially this week, it was the truth. I didn't feel like I had enough time at all. And so I felt strangely calm as I was going up there. And this week I preached the same sermon, or a very, very similar sermon, for 2 different worship services. We have at Redlands Church, we have kind of a contemporary worship service in our auditorium space that's brilliant and wonderful, contemporary, like modern music, and young people who are talented musicians who lead that. And so I love the chance to get to preach over there, because I get to worship with them and enjoy that time together. And then I went over and preached at our later 11 o'clock service, which is sort of more of a traditional blended kind of family service. And it's beautiful and great as well, and in an amazing space. And so I preached it twice, so maybe my calm was part of that. I sort of had this first version that was a little more in a space that's a little less formal, and I got to run through it with them. And then I got to do, that was sort of maybe not, I mean, I didn't treat it like a practice run. It's obviously not a practice run. I mean, I gave it everything I had. But the more times you do things, the more comfortable you feel with it. And so by the time I got going on the second version of it, I'd already gone through it once. So maybe my calmness was to do with that. I don't know, or maybe the spiritual retreat just affected me in beautiful, wonderful ways, and it helped me to have less anxiety about this sermon and it being perfect and whatever. I do have to admit that once it was all over, I did feel some relief, because not only did I preach the 2 sermons on Saturday morning, I had a whole other sermon that I gave on Friday night. And it was using some old material that I had used about a year ago, or not a year ago, like 8 months ago. I had the glorious privilege and opportunity to speak for Walla Walla University community, which is their weekly sort of all-school worship convocation kind of event on campus. And so I was invited to speak about secrets for that. And so I used some of that material on Friday night. And but even then, I mean, I still had to go through it. I still had to practice. I still had to rework it some for that particular audience. And so I had 3 different sermons in a 2-day span, and on a week where I was away for 3 days and then sick for 3 days. So I would be lying if I didn't say that I felt some degree of relief when the whole thing was over, and that I definitely felt some relief. And so that's just true. In addition, I also felt a little bit self-conscious about the used car salesman thing. I was being honest. Like, let's just be real. I do not enjoy buying cars because I feel like I'm getting taken advantage of, and I care about people, and so when the used car guy comes and talks to me and says, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" and asks me questions, I automatically think that they really care about me, and maybe some of them do. And anyway, so I felt self-conscious about the fact that I kind of came down on used car salesmen. I wouldn't want anyone to feel bad or hurt anyone's feelings, and I'm sort of scared and worried that there are people in our congregation who are car salesmen or some other sorts of salesmen, and I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. So I felt self-conscious and kind of bad about that, because I sort of made a big deal about how people who sell stuff or have ulterior motives or whatever. And, I tried to bring it back. I tried to make the comment of like, listen, my own mother did sales for a lot of years, and I love her, and I'm grateful for her work, and I don't have any judgment against her or the profession in general. But, some people, it may have hurt their feelings. So anyway, if you were one of them and I hurt your feelings, I am sorry. I do not hold harsh judgments against people who do sales, and I know that it's possible to do sales ethically and kindly and with thought and with empathy, and to do to sell quality products at reasonable prices, and to be upfront and give good warranty. I know that you can do that and do it well. I know you don't have to be a total curmudgeon to be a salesperson. So anyway. My favorite parts, continuing on with the microphone therapist, because obviously I love this segment of the show. My favorite part was really, was the whole sermon. Kind of. I mean, I like the idea of putting myself in the story. I really like that. That sort of methodology of reading the text. So I like that concept of, okay, congregation, you are the friends. And so what does that mean for your life? And there's all kinds of things we could learn. And we could go back and do the same sermon again and say, okay, you are the paralyzed man. What can we learn about your life? Okay, you are the crowd, the people that were blocking the door. What can we learn about your life? Like, just that is a way of reading the scriptures. And it's one that Walter Wink actually kind of introduced or created, or I don't know if he created it, but he's credited as having some influence. And it's sort of this idea of reading ourselves into the characters of the script. And there's this quote that I came across about written by Walter Wink about interpreting scripture. And this is how it goes. What is it about others that makes us feel that they are lepers? What is it that we fear about them? What is it about us that makes us feel like lepers, untouchable? What makes us helpers? Who would struggle up a roof and dig our way through it to bring another to the source of healing? What in us makes us give up in the face of crowds? What in us is like the teacher of the law, the cool intellectual, the skeptical observer, the judgmental specialist? The scribe in us certainly does not want Jesus reminding us that we have sins in need of forgiving as well. What in us is like the paralyzed man who needs to hear the word of forgiveness? What in us makes us feel helpless and enslaved by an alien power like the man with the unclean spirit? So Walter Wink gives sort of this way of reading the text. And so I love that idea, and I love using it in the sermon. And in this case, we had 3 observations, 3 things that we might learn about ourselves as we looked at these friends of the paralyzed man. So I liked that use. Another thing that I liked was something that didn't happen at the early service at Relevant. It only happened at the 11 a.m. service, and that was the scripture reading. It's something that we don't do every week at Redlands Church, and in most churches I've been a part of over the years, haven't always done it consistently. It's kind of come and gone here and there. But I really liked this way of sort of folding it into the sermon. And there were 2 young people who were part of our congregation. They're teenagers. Brother and sister, and they came up and read. They did such a great job. It was sort of like almost like a dramatic reading. They had practiced it and done parts, and it was so good. And I loved it because it involved more people in the program and involved these kids. But I also loved it because it sort of gives the text, it gives the sermon sort of a special place in the service. It gives it this sort of special moment, this special reverence where we're going to take time. And I know that there are some traditions where the congregation actually stands when the scripture is read, and there's something about that resonates with me as well. So I liked the scripture reading. Finally, the other thing that I really, really enjoyed was something that happened in this case at the early service, but not at the later service. So like I said, the earlier services, it tends to be less formal. And there are lots of tables, and people kind of sit around in groups. And so I like to throw out discussion questions. I don't know if they like those discussion questions or not, but I did 3 different. So I closed each of the 3 sections, each of the 3 observations in the sermon. I closed each one of those with a question for people to discuss, and especially the first one I really, really liked. I really resonated with it. I think it's a challenging question that is confronting no matter which way you answer it. And the question was, which is harder for you? Is it harder for you to give a tangible handout to someone? Is it harder for you to drop $1 in the bucket? Which, honestly, for some of us, that is quite difficult because we sort of think about, well, how are they going to use it for, and blah, 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 and all those other things. Or is it harder for you to give some kind of spiritual care? Is it harder for you to pray or to ask them about how they're doing with God or whatever? So sort of that question, is it harder for you to do some kind of tangible physical thing to help someone, or is it harder for you to sort of engage on the spiritual level? And I think no matter which end of the spectrum we tend to be on, it has something to teach us about ourselves. If I have a hard time with sort of engaging someone interpersonally and asking what's going on in their life and maybe sharing about something about myself, what does that have to say about me? Maybe I'm not accessing those parts of myself. Maybe I'm not paying attention to that. Maybe I'm not comfortable with my own inner life. Or on the other hand, if I'm not comfortable doing handouts, why is that? Is it because I'm afraid of what's going to happen? Do I have a sense of insecurity? What exactly is going on in my life that's sort of making me not feel comfortable doing that? Am I afraid? Do I have scarcity problems? What exactly is it? So I really liked that discussion question thing, and like I said, it only happened in one service and not in the other. So if you're a member of the Redlands Church and you're listening to this, hey, when I'm preaching at both, you got to come to both because you're gonna miss stuff. How do you like that shameless plug? Ridiculous. All right, we're going to continue on with Microphone Therapist. It is clearly my favorite segment of the show, and it's also the longest segment of the show. So there you go. The parts of the sermon that I didn't like, that I didn't enjoy as much, and why. So the first illustration about my trip to Europe, I mean, I think it worked. It was fun. It was silly, but I also kind of felt like it was a little bit clunky. It was sort of, that story was about expectations, clearly, but it wasn't about expectations in the same way as I was using it for that first part. So, I don't think that it dovetailed perfectly, but I think it worked okay as an introduction, and we made it work. It was all right, but I wasn't super thrilled with that. That came in pretty late in the game. I think I added that on Friday at some point. Another thing that I didn't like quite as much was, I spent some time at the beginning talking about sort of this justice versus holiness motif, and this is a big thing. I don't think I was understating it at all, or I don't think I was overstating it at all when I was talking about my program at Fuller Seminary. And I also think that discussion resonates with this particular congregation because our church is full of people who have given themselves to a life of service, whether they're work in medicine or they're therapists or they're teachers or whatever. These are people who sense a high level of calling in their lives to whatever they happen to be doing. And so thinking about the nature of their work is something that I think that many of them do frequently. And so anyway, the reason that I say that I don't totally like the section that much is that I think that it's a little bit oversimplified in the sermon when compared to how I actually think and feel about it. And it's fine. Like I definitely feel comfortable saying what I said, but I don't know. If I had it to do over again, or if I had it to explain in a one-on-one context with someone, I might describe it with a little bit more nuance. I do think that there's interplay between justice and what I might call healing, as opposed to using the holiness or salvation word, where I think that as we're healed, we become people who want to take part in creating and establishing justice, and at the same time, when we are people who are partakers or we're blessed with justice, we are people who in a way get to the need for healing. We're not injured in the same way or in the same. We're not as likely to be injured, and so therefore we're not likely to have to go through healing. And so there's sort of this interplay between them that I think is I don't really think that there are these separate, discrete categories. And anyway, it's just I don't know. I think that had I spent another 20 hours, thinking about that section, I think that it probably would have been better. But isn't that my life? So, and then finally, another part that I didn't like quite as much is I didn't particularly care for the ending. I felt like it was kind of abrupt. I didn't summarize much. I just ended on that final point and then was done. And I mean, I think that it worked okay. But I'd done these 3 pieces all throughout the sermon, and I didn't really come around to summarize. I wish that I would have done something that was a little bit more emotive and a little bit more, asking people to think about who in your life is the paralyzed person, or I don't know. It just felt clunky. I didn't feel like I really connected the real life applications very well, and maybe even some of them might have been confusing to people about what I was getting at, or And it's funny though, with all of that being said, how much I didn't like the ending. With all of that being said, I really did like the transition into the song. It's funny because the song wasn't one that I picked, and it was one that the lead singer, the worship leader, that he had picked sometime before. He had picked it before he had really heard about what the sermon was about, and it was kind of like, okay, well, this is it. Hopefully it fits, and it was fine that is how it worked out. Some weeks we're able to really intentionally think through and tie the songs, and sometimes it doesn't work quite that well, and it's always amazing how the service works either way. And I've often made the comment, and I've heard my colleagues do the same, that any preacher worth his or her salt can use any illustration for any purpose. And and you can make something work with it no matter what. If you're a B+ preacher at all. And so I liked what we ended up doing with that final lead in to the song of imagine your paralyzed friend singing this, and will you be the answer? And again, that may have been clunky, but I kind of liked it. I thought it kind of worked, and so there's Microphone Therapist for you. And the next segment of our show is called Killing Your Darlings. Killing Your Darlings. And for those of you who've been listening for a while, you know that this is a phrase that comes from literature, comes from writing, and it's all about you have to cut things that don't advance the plot. And so always with a sermon, there's material that just doesn't make the cut, and you got to take it out, or else the sermon will be not good and probably too long, and people will not be helped. They'll check out. Maybe they'll even physically leave during your sermon. And so it's important to cut stuff out. And so we kill our darlings every time that we preach. At least some of us do, and I certainly do. So what I left out of this sermon this week, and why, and was it a good choice? That's sort of the question of this segment. There was a whole line of thought that I read and came across in some of the commentaries I was working on, that I was reading, and it kind of raises the question: what if the paralyzed man? What if his problem was a hysterical nervous condition to an overactive guilty conscience that caused for him psychosomatic paralysis? And so what if the treatment for his physical paralysis was feeling forgiven? And anyway, so there was one commentator that he spent, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 pages discussing what if this was psychosomatic paralysis, and forgiveness was the cure, and Jesus knew it. And so when he healed him, and I don't know if this is sort of a way of getting around the idea of the miraculous, or the idea of the supernatural. I'm not really sure. I didn't study into it a ton in this particular commentator, but anyway, it was kind of an interesting idea. And I read a bunch of other stuff where there were insightful observations. None of us, at least today, are scandalized by Jesus' offer of forgiveness. Clearly, his contemporary, Bible scholar types were scandalized by his offer of forgiveness. But today, none of us are. What bothers us today is the suggestion that sin brings physical consequences into our lives. That was sort of the underlying assumption, that if you do things wrong, that you're going to suffer in your body. And so if it was sort of generally agreed upon that if you saw someone like this paralyzed man, that somewhere underneath there was sin that had caused it. Like he's getting what he deserves. It's sort of, I mean, that's the dialogue that you see all through the book of Job, right? Job was saying, listen, I'm a righteous person. I don't deserve this. And then all of his friends were coming to help, quote unquote, help, saying, hey, Job, you keep saying that you have it all together and you're fine and whatever. But the fact that you're suffering through this is a demonstration that you have secret sin in your life. And so just come clean, just be honest, just tell us the truth. And we can all let's all be real together. All right. We all know that the only reason anybody has stuff like this happen to them is because they're being punished. So just admit it. And so I feel like today when we read this story, we want to avoid that discussion about whether or not sickness relates to sin. And so we and none of us are bothered by the idea that Jesus forgives sin. You know, it's something that's we're completely comfortable with. And so anyway, you know, and in a way, we want to be the opposite of Job's friends. We don't want to blame the victim. We don't want to come across like every bit of suffering that we come across and to say, oh, well, it's because you deserve it. Like we see that as being unempathetic. We don't want to do that. So there's this whole side conversation, all right, just to step out of that flow again, that really, I don't know where it was going to work with the sermon. I mean, I guess I could have had a section where I talked about how how I could have contrasted these friends, the friends of the paralyzed man, with the friends of Job. But then that sort of begs the question to have a conversation about sin, and it just didn't totally work. But you could think about that yourself. I mean, there's something interesting there, contrasting Job's friends and the paralyzed man's friends. How were they different? How were they the same? Maybe that's a question I could have carried throughout the sermon that would have been interesting. I'm not sure. But personally, I feel a little bit sketchy about getting into the conversation about the psychosomatic thing, and was it a miracle or was it not a miracle, or was it just a super pragmatic thing, or was Jesus a master physician that was a master at using the material world? Like it gets real dicey for a preacher real quick, especially for something that I don't have a strong bone to pick about. But there are sins, quote unquote sins, destructive, broken patterns in our lives that do result in disease. We know some of them today, like overeating results in obesity. And maybe some people would argue with my characterization of overeating as a sin. I certainly am not judging anyone else. I'd be pointing the finger at myself first before anyone else, because it certainly I've struggled myself with obesity and with overeating. So, or you could argue eating unhealthy foods, getting the wrong thing. And this is, the thing that I'm working on personally right now is trying to think of and consider food as fuel, as nutrition, as opposed to eating food for pleasure or to cope. It's a challenge, and that's I label it sin, not in like a shameful, dark, I need to feel guilty sort of way, but just as a, hey, this is not super functional, right? Secret sin, I wrote a book about keeping secrets, and it's being edited right now, and hopefully it'll be released soon. But one of the things that I discuss in the book is about how there's a direct connection between keeping secrets and physical illness. There's actually a study done by the NIH that found that certain types of secret keeping actually led people to have a higher disposition for developing certain cancers. And it's more of an association type study, not like a direct cause, but the association is there. Thinking about sexuality outside the context of a committed relationship. The scriptures talk about that as being sin, and there are often illnesses that go along with that sort of behavior, or at least sometimes there's illnesses that go along with that. Gluttony of entertainment, gluttony. Binge watching stuff, it leads to physical disrepair, like depression and not being motivated and so on. Failure to remember keeping the Sabbath, for example, the failure to keep our bodies and our lives in a predictable rhythm of work and then rest. It leads us to being overtaxed and stressed. And so we could probably make lists on and on and on about the many ways that different kinds of disordered living affect our physical bodies. And so anyway, it's an interesting conversation. And then to ask specifically, well, what did Jesus do, and why was this man paralyzed, and was it because of some sin in his life? And we don't know answers to any of that. It sort of makes me think about the story about the blind man who the religious teachers bring to Jesus and ask, whose fault is it that this man was born blind? Was it something that he did, or was it his parents, right? And Jesus challenges that whole assumption that comes from a worldview saying that physical ailments are from sin. So anyway, that's one element that I left out, and it's pretty big, as you can tell. I've just spent, I don't know how long, 10 minutes talking about it, and that's you could easily do a whole sermon just on that concept. There is a quote that I saw. This is another item that was left out, but there was a quote that I saw from Len Sweet. He's a professor and an author and religious teacher. He's a Christian. He's very prolific. I don't know how he produces the amount of material that he creates, but it's a lot. But he has this line about healing and about faith. Healing involves far more than the physical dimension. It involves mental, social, and spiritual dimensions as well. Faith, prayer, and a deep sense of forgiveness of sins are therefore not simply religious placebos. He goes on. The healing forces of faith, hope, and love are not incidental to health and medicine. Like an antibiotic, faith, hope, and love enter the system quickly and do their work slowly. Curing or the removal of disease may take place with medical means alone, but healing or the triumphal re-entry into one's total environment only takes place in partnership with faith. Medical healing is the knowledge of God manifest through science. Spiritual healing is the knowledge of God manifested through faith. It is the same knowledge. It is the same God. And that line of reasoning is, in some ways, is connected to the previous section where I was talking about, the nature of sin and the body and so on. It's obviously connected, but this specifically focuses on the force and the power of faith, hope, and love. And it's something that I sort of touched on, and it's I would have had to take something else out to go there. I suppose it's possible that I could have maybe tried to close with this, but it's not directly connected to everything else that I was doing in the sermon. So I'm not sure if it would entirely work. So it ended up being left out. But I love the quote. I love the line. I love the line of thinking. In a way, it sort of. Yeah, it reminds. I like. Well, I don't know what it reminds me of, but it reminds. I like that line. Medical healing is the knowledge of God manifest through science. Spiritual healing is the knowledge of God manifest through faith. I like this. I like the idea that there are sort of different spheres that lead us to truth, and I believe in one God, one divine. Being who kind of ties all those things together, but there are these different spheres whereby we might arrive at what is true. There's different, like investigative platforms, and I like that he sort of touches on that here. So anyway, that's a section that was left out. I have a couple more items that I left out of this sermon that were cut. They were darlings that were killed. Most of the commentaries I read had some discussion about the phrase "the Son of Man" in this passage and in the book of Mark in general. It's a really important phrase, and it's generally agreed that that Mark, when he is using this phrase, or when Jesus speaks this phrase in the book of Mark, that he is referring to the Christological title from Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7. But and so therefore is the promised one, the Messiah, the one that's coming, that was prophesied about, etc. And so Jesus, when he uses this phrase, and when Mark uses this phrase in his book, he's trying to point out Jesus' identity, who he is. He's the Christ. He's the coming one. He's the Messiah. He's the promise. He's the one that's prophesied about, etc. So most of the commentators discussed and talked about how that phrase, Son of Man, is actually used in at least two other ways in the original Aramaic, which was the language that most likely Jesus spoke during his ministry. And of course, Mark and the other New Testament books were largely written in Greek, which was sort of the common language of trade at the time. So Aramaic is a Semitic language, and it is, kind of related to Arabic or to Hebrew. It's sort of one of those styles of languages. And the phrase "Son of Man" is a common one, and it is in Aramaic, and it can refer to Son of Man. You could use that phrase to refer to mean humanity, or like the whole of humanity. So you could make a statement, and that's that's one of the equivalents as Son of Humanity, but also it can be used in sort of not a figurative sense, but like a poetic sense, to mean I. It's like almost like how sometimes people will talk about themselves in the third person, and everyone understands that they're talking about themselves, but they're saying, well, Chris was sitting at his desk drinking a cup of coffee, recording a podcast, and you could easily substitute in, I was sitting at my desk drinking a cup of coffee and recording a podcast. Anyway, so Son of Man can be used to refer to humanity and to I, to me, to myself. And so there was some conversation about what Jesus may or may not have been doing with that phrase, and maybe there was a play on words in one of the comments. Anyway, none of that really fit in the sermon, but I found that conversation about how that word is used and how Jesus uses it, and how it was like potentially like not an inside joke, but an inside comment that those who were familiar with Daniel and who were part of the Jewish tradition would have understood what Jesus was getting at. And at the same time, it also would have made sense to everyone in that context if Jesus was saying, listen, I am Lord of the Sabbath, right? As opposed to the Son of Man, or the Messiah is the Lord of the Sabbath. So there's sort of this sneaky, slow revealing of Jesus' identity. And there's one scholar that I read on the book of Mark who actually makes the argument that, and this is a book I read some years ago, and he makes the argument that the book of Mark structurally goes through the phases of evangelism for someone, or goes through the phases of conversion for someone, and that Mark is very carefully pulling back the curtain on Jesus' identity over the course of the book, and that's kind of the point of the book, is that Mark is trying to reveal this is who Jesus is, and the characters in the story have this process of dawning and belief that develop over the course of the book that somewhat mirrors the process of conversion that most people go through, and so the fact that you have this kind of shadowy, I guess, language about Jesus' identity at the beginning would kind of go with that. Early on in the story, it's a little bit hazy, but then it becomes more clear. And anyway, so that was one item that got left out that I found interesting. Finally, there was a little piece. There was a kind of a joke that I thought about using. I made the point early on. The first section of the sermon, or the first observation, was that the friends brought their paralyzed friend to be healed, not to be forgiven. Right? They came with different expectations, and I kind of had this joke about, well, what if you were a doctor and someone comes in with a big laceration on their forehead, and instead of like stitching it up, you say, I want you to know that you have great fashion sense. I want you to know that I think you are amazing. You have a great eye for stuff. Those pants, they match your shoes. You are remarkable. I hope that you feel affirmed about your gifting in life. And of course, that would be a very sweet and kind thing for a physician to say. Or for anyone to say, it feels good to be affirmed about, especially, about your fashion sense. Some people that's more meaningful than to others, but it feels good. But in that circumstance, the expectation was different, and that kind of compliment might have felt disappointing. And so I wondered to myself as I read the story if the paralyzed man and if the friends might have been disappointed by Jesus saying you are forgiven. Like, that's clearly not what they were coming for. And they may have not even appreciated it. If they were living fully within sort of the sin causes illness thing, that's the first deal we discussed in this section. Then they may have sort of understood the weight of that Jesus gave them. But if they weren't, then they would have been like, well, why are you forgiving? I didn't come for forgiveness. I don't need forgiveness. I'm not looking for that. I want to be able to walk, man. Come on, stitch up the forehead. So that I don't know. I kind of originally wrote it in there as sort of a joke. I don't know if it's funny. Did you laugh? I didn't laugh just now. But anyway, it didn't work. It kind of felt like it was going to take the sermon in a different direction, and so anyway, that got left out. But I have the podcast now, right? And I have this outlet where I get to share with you all these different interesting side roads and pathways and rabbit trails that I could have taken, but I didn't. And the sermon was under 30 minutes this week. And it was under 30 minutes because I cut all that stuff that I just spent, 30 minutes talking about. So there you go. You're welcome, folks. That would be the section called Killing Your Darlings. And now we're off to the next segment, which, as it happens, is the segment containing the longest title of the show. Wisdom is the act of thinking something stupid and not saying it. Wisdom is the act of thinking something stupid, but not saying it. And it drives at the question, if I had it to do all over again, what would I change? What did I learn? How would I do differently? This segment is about applied wisdom, and tends to be one of the shorter segments, and we'll see if that holds today with today's episode. But, I mentioned back at the beginning of the show that this was kind of a crazy week for me. I was sick, and I had that spiritual retreat, and just lots and lots of stuff. I preached 3 different times, and just a lot of stuff. And so I made the decision that I was going to try to preach off of an outline instead of manuscripting this particular sermon. I was going to preach out of an outline. And I was gonna just try to be myself and to be more natural and to just sort of let it flow. And, I mentioned that speech that I gave on Friday night about keeping secrets. And that was one that was very highly scripted. It was one that I essentially had memorized and had written it out word for word, and it was tight and relatively short. I did it at Walla Walla University. And actually, if you go on my YouTube channel, you can watch that presentation in its entirety. But I think for that setting, for an academic setting on a tight schedule, it was important for it to be polished and so on. But here in this church context, it's a family church. It's more informal. People are much more real. They are looking for something practical for their lives. Many of them would wish and already do, know me personally and know the other pastors and want to know each other. And so, there are different styles of preaching for different contexts is sort of what I'm driving at. And so I decided this week that I was going to preach, from an outline. And part of that was just, self-survival, I wasn't going to have time to do much else. And so that was going to be what it was going to be. And, I felt pretty good about it. I think I might start experimenting more with working off of an outline and practicing it ahead of time, going through it so that it's living in my heart. But maybe trying to be a little more free with the material, and maybe it'll come off a little more like this podcast does. So that's something I learned, and perhaps will be something that I'll apply going forward. A second item that I learned was, I don't know if I learned it this week, but it will become applied wisdom in my life, and that's the idea of layering. Working on multiple weeks of sermons all at the same time. So this week I'm preaching. October 5 is the date, and then I preach again on the 19th. And I'm going to work on sermons for both of those weeks this week, and try to just work ahead. It was so helpful to me this week to have some thoughts on paper, some ideas, some of the studying done, kind of a general idea of what direction I was going to go in with this sermon. So helpful then to come and just to have a completely blank page with no ideas. So I'm going to continue on that sort of layering track, that layering path where I'm looking ahead and thinking about what I'm doing in future weeks. And I'm going to continue to do that just going forward in general. So we'll have some fun with that. Finally, something that I learned or applied wisdom is, self-care is powerful. It's important. This past week was a week that was quite characterized by self-care. I did some spiritual work. I exercised at least early on in the week before I got sick. I exercised every day, and I can tell you, at least in my life, exercise is like the greatest antidepressant, greatest anti-anxiety, greatest mental health tool that I know of personally. It's just incredibly powerful. And I know that it's not the only tool that is in the box, and for a lot of people it's one of many tools that they will make use of in their lives, and including different medications or therapists or whatever. But for me, man, exercise, it makes me feel so much better. My outlook on life is better. It's really a powerful, useful thing. And so this last couple of weeks, really, the week last week, obviously I was sick, but then the week before I exercised pretty much every day, and I felt so good. It makes such a difference to spend that time, to prioritize that. And even if that pulls me away from, if I go spend an hour jogging, and that pulls me away from an hour of sermon prep time, my next hour of sermon prep time will probably be triple or quadruple as productive. And so it's sort of an exponential thing, a hidden thing. And it's something that I have to trust, because sort of the knee-jerk logical, quote unquote, logical thing would be that no, you need to work as hard as possible all the time, and otherwise you won't make it. And so yeah, self-care is powerful. So that was the last little bit of applied wisdom that I will try to apply in my life. Before we close this one out, our final segment is called Intent versus Impact. Intent versus Impact. I don't know why I'm saying it that way. Intent. Most of us would say, what was the intent? Intent versus impact. And this is the section of the show where I ask for your questions. I ask for your feedback. I request suggestions and input and feedback I've received so far. And, I've really appreciated your comments and emails and messages and so on about the show. I've had a lot of good conversations with folks about, how the show should be put together and what order things should be in. And you'll probably notice that we've bounced back and forth a little bit in terms of where the sermon falls. And it's kind of become clear to me that depending on who you are in the audience, your answer to what order the thing should happen in shifts. So if you're someone who is not a regular part of the Redlands Church community, if you live somewhere else in the world, and you're not necessarily engaging in my weekly sermon material and you're listening to these sort of as one-offs, then it might be more useful to hear the sermon up front early on in the episode, and then it sort of gives you the context for what even the whole thing is about. But then if you are part of the Redlands Church community and you've already heard the sermon, then it might be like, oh man, I don't know if I want to hear this again. For you, it might be better to have the sermon come at the end, and then you could decide whether or not you want to listen to it. And so it sort of becomes clear to me that it depends on who is my primary audience here in this show, and who are the main people that are listening and who are engaging with it, who's on with this, and so that's sort of become clear, and maybe that was obvious to some of you all along, and I should have known that. But we're going to keep playing with it and kind of seeing how it goes. But as you can tell, for this episode, we had the sermon up front, closer to the beginning, and I'm kind of leaning toward that direction, and then just giving you the time marker for where to fast forward to if you do not wish to listen to the sermon again before listening to the commentary. So, that's probably what we're still doing. It's funny as a new pastor. I've only been here at the Redlands Church for about 3 or 4. I think it maybe has almost been 4 months now. So I'm still quite new. And this church, the congregation has been so sweet, so wonderful, welcoming, including, kind, thoughtful. It's been really, really good. And I think that there's a small part that goes along with that, which is this sort of a honeymoon period. And so I don't know if how much like super clear, constructive feedback I'm getting yet. I think at some point people, we'll start to have closer relationships, and some people will feel more comfortable sharing what they actually think. But I'm primarily hearing positive now, and I know that I'm not so wonderful and perfect that can possibly be all true. So, so I'm looking forward to hearing some more feedback that's constructive, that's helpful, because I'm someone who wishes to grow and wishes to make stuff better, and yeah, so I'm sure that will continue to happen over time. One question that I have for you, the listeners, though, is what segments do you think we should add to the show? We have these sort of 5 core segments right now. We have the opening segment, which is about context, right? And then we've been running the sermon, the audio of the sermon. And then the last 4 segments are the microphone therapist, which is the longest one, Killing Your Darlings, the section about wisdom with the super long title, or short title, as in this case, wisdom, and then intent versus impact. which is the final segment of the show. So I'm just wondering, are there other things that you think that would be worth doing regularly in the program? I like having segments because it gives it structure, and it kind of, I think that there's a part about it that's soothing and clear and so on. There's one segment that I plan to add from time to time, depending on the content of the sermon, and that's a segment called Fact Check, where I will bring on an expert in a certain field to talk with me about whether or not I was completely out to lunch. So like for example, in this episode, I talked about Semitic languages and Aramaic and whatever. And so I could bring on an expert. I have some friends that are linguists, and I could bring them on the show and say, hey, okay, tell me, how am I wrong? What did I get wrong? What did I get right? Is that actually clear? Is that how you would say it for people who are actually in the know, in the field? Anyway, I think that could be fun depending on what the topic was. I just haven't had the right material yet to bring that segment in. That will be an occasional segment, Fact Check. But you, honestly, do you have any ideas for segments that you think I should include, or maybe should be occasional bits and pieces along the way? I'm just asking. I'm throwing that out there. So send me a message, say it on Facebook, or send me an Instagram message, or email me, or whatever. I would love to hear from you. So thank you so much for joining me on the program. As always, I would highly value you taking a moment to give the show a 5-star rating and a quick little review. You only have to do a few sentences. Just say, hey, the show's great, I like it, blah blah blah. This is why you should listen to it. It's good. It makes a huge difference in other people being able to find it. So if you would take that time to do that right on your phone, it would be a huge gift to me. Continue to share the show with people you think would value it on social media. When you see me post it, share it, like it, comment on it. It kind of boosts the signal. It helps other people to see it. I so appreciate that. You can learn more about our program on behindthesermon.com, or just go to chrislowen.com and click the logo. You'll find it. We are currently on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn, Google Play, where our episodes are going live on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, Loker, Lowekr. We're all over the place, so you can listen wherever you would like to listen, wherever fine podcasts are found. And I'm certain that because we're in all those major platforms, you could find us in off the beaten path places as well. Many blessings to you. God's richest blessings over your life. I'm praying now. May you know that you are loved exactly as you are, that you are enough, and that there's space for you in this world, and that you have been made to give and to serve and to be and to create something unique and beautiful here on this planet, and we're cheering you on. Hey, God bless. This is Kristopher Lowen signing off. All the best to you.